You're listening to Reap Sow, dispatches from the front lines of food, farming, and the environment. I'm your host, Teresa Katsourelis. This week, we're hearing from Lakota chef Sean Sherman. His restaurant in Minneapolis, Owamni, is devoted to showcasing indigenous ingredients and cuisine. It won the James Beard Award for Best New Restaurant in the Country in 2022. Last September, FERN's editor-in-chief, Theodore Ross, interviewed Sherman about his fight to decolonize food.
A lot of this came from my own philosophy on what decolonization means. So to really understand that, I had to understand what colonization meant.
This was part of our partnership with Switchyard, a literary magazine and radio show hosted by Ted Genoways from the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa. Ted takes it from here.
Hey, John. Hola, hola. Hola. Hey, chef.
From the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa, this is Switchyard, a podcast for people hungry for eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. I'm Ted Genoways, editor of Switchyard magazine, and your host. Join me and our lineup of literary all-stars as we think through and hash out our world's difficult and fascinating challenges. In September, I had the chance to travel to Minneapolis with Theodore Ross, the editor-in-chief of the Food and Environment Reporting Network, a nonprofit news organization based in New York City. Ross and I met up for dinner at Owamni, which won the 2022 James Beard Foundation Award for Best New Restaurant. It's a whole menu made from ingredients used by indigenous peoples in North America before the arrival of white settlers. Sean Sherman, the chef and owner of Owamni, who is Lakota Sioux, calls this decolonizing the kitchen. We had delicious elk tacos, earthy grilled sweet potatoes topped with a maple chili crisp, and a rich, buttery smoked bison ribeye. Sherman burst onto the food scene when his book, The Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, won the 2018 James Beard Foundation Award for Best American Cookbook. That's Sioux Chef, S-I-O-U-X. Get it? Since then, he's become the toast of the restaurant industry. He recently won the 2023 Julia Child Award. But Theodore Ross wanted to talk to Sherman about more than just the food. He wanted to hear about how Sherman is seizing this moment to effect political change, and what it even means to run a political restaurant. So the day after we had dinner at Owamni, Ross sat down with Sherman in a small room in the basement under the restaurant for a conversation. A longer version of this interview appears in the winter 2024 issue of Switchyard magazine. You can order a copy online or read it on our new website at switchyardmag.com.
Hi, Chef. I'm Theodore Ross from the Food and Environment Reporting Network. Nice to meet you.
Nice to see you. Thanks for coming. So here we are at Owamni. This is the entranceway to give you a showcase of where we are. This is a map of Minnesota and all their waterways. We have the Mississippi River that comes down. You have the Minnesota River that goes up this way. And where these two rivers meet is called Bedote, and it's a really sacred space for the Dakota people. Owamni is the true name of this place that we're standing on. Where we are, there used to be this wonderful waterfall, and the original waterfall was about 300 feet across and about 40 feet down. In the Dakota language, the name of the waterfall was Owamni Yamni, which meant place of the falling, swirling water. And the name of Mississippi in Dakota language is Hahawakpa, which means River of the Falls. So we're on a really sacred and special space, and we feel really blessed that this restaurant happened to show up right here, basically the heart of the Mississippi for the Dakota people. So here we are, and we greet people with this obvious sign. It just says, "You are on native land."
And you can't miss it. It's
bright neon.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. And just a little reminder, we have our James Beard Award for winning the best restaurant in the United States last year, which is obviously a big award. We have some sage, and our staff smudges basically every day before service, a couple of times a day. So they burn some sage, and it's just a nice little ceremony to have to start your shift with. We're something unique because it's not typical to find a Native American restaurant out there, even though no matter where we are, we're on Native land. And we have a wonderful staff. We have over 100 employees over here, and about 70% of our staff identifies as indigenous. We have an open kitchen, so you can always see people just bustling around.
And I can smell right now something smoky. Is that the smoked bison I had last night?
Yeah, probably, because they usually have a little smoker rolling, and there's some meats and vegetables and things like that going, and everybody's just busy.
I'm excited to see the kitchen.
So we'll just kind of wander back through. We'll come through the back end. We'll pass through the dish pit.
Yep.
So we'll just take a peek back here. Hi, guys. Big open line. Everybody's just constantly always busy, shifting, hustling. And we typically have 4 people working back here at one time.
And this is the rice, the wild rice?
That's the true wild rice. And you can tell the difference because if you've cooked wild rice from the grocery store, you usually get the black stuff, which cooks forever. And it's just a completely different thing. But this rice is all from Minnesota. And it's just a really special situation because it only grows on these Great Lakes around this area.
How is it harvested?
We're getting hand harvested rice. So what happens with this rice is they actually go out in canoes and they'll have one guy push the canoe through the reeds of all the grass that's sticking up above the water. And they have a guy in the back with 2 big sticks that they just call knockers, and they'll pull some reeds over with one stick and hit the other stick with the other one, and all the rice seeds drop into their canoe. And they just do that over and over. It becomes really rhythmic. It's just kind of a doosh, doosh, doosh. And then they just fill up their canoe, go back to shore, and then they have a parching station where they just slowly churn it over a wood fire to kind of toast it a little bit. It releases the chaff on the outside, and then they winnow it and get all that stuff to blow away, and you have this perfectly beautiful wild rice.
It was delicious. I had it last night. I almost got 2 orders of it. It was really good.
Yeah, it's just something super unique, and you typically don't find it in grocery stores. You can find it around Minnesota, but you're not going to find it pretty much anywhere else. And Joe, you're cutting up some bison? Masada.
Yeah.
For some tacos. You're processing some squash. Hola, ¿cómo está? So it's a tight space, but we pump a lot of food through this little kitchen, and it's just always constantly churning and boiling and turning and all the things. And we also have the patio open. Let's take a peek. So we have this space too. You just get this beautiful view, and it's just a really great space. One thing that we did too is when we built this whole space out, we put only indigenous plants back in around this park area. And then we'll walk around and you'll see these little placards that'll show the Dakota name of that plant first, because that's the true name of that plant
really?
in the soil. And then an English descriptor of what these plants are used for. And you see a lot of these flavors in the menu. So we got a bunch of red cedar up here. Some of them produce all the berries, just like juniper berries. Here's a little sign that talks about it right there.
How do you pronounce that?
Hante Shah.
And that in English is Eastern Red Cedar.
Yeah, Shah is red, and Hante means the cedar itself. It's just part of the juniper family, because these little berries, it's just like juniper if you've ever used juniper berries and things before. It's a strong, potent flavor, but we use a lot of it. We've got a bunch of wild onions just kind of popped in there too.
So looking out across the Mississippi River, we can see St. Anthony Falls. This is not a very natural setting.
Now, all these mills back then at the turn of the 1800s, they ruined the natural feature of the waterfalls because they kept drilling holes and tunnels and pipes and all the heavy logs coming down, because all the old growth forests that were getting deforested and pushed down the river were all coming down this waterfall. And it just destroyed the really delicate soil structure that was underneath the waterfall. So eventually the Army Corps of Engineers came in and they built what you see today, which is concrete skirting on one part and a lock and dam in front of us for a lot of the movement of the boats that used to come through. But the lock and dam is no longer in use.
But the location here in this formerly natural space, and you've brought your restaurant here, which is hearkening back to a pre-contact era in North America. What do you feel about that? Why is it important to have the restaurant right here?
We just happened to find a place in this extremely beautiful location with a really intense, important history for the Dakota people and the Anishinaabe people that lived here before and still live here.
What does decolonized food mean? What does that term mean?
It's a lot to unpack. A lot of this came from my own philosophy on what decolonization means. So to really understand that, I had to understand what colonization meant. So like colonization is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying its settlers, exploiting it economically. You can boil that down to just exploitation for profit if you really want to. And we see colonization in many forms happening still today with education, with food, with whatever. So for us, it was understanding what happened here in America for American colonization, and particularly because I grew up on Pine Ridge Reservation and I'm enrolled with the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe. We were still battling the United States government up until the late 1800s. We kind of still are, really. When I started looking backwards in my family history to understand why did I not have any education about my own Lakota foods? Why was that piece missing? And why did I not have access to any Lakota foods growing up on Pine Ridge? We had a very small group of things that we had that were still Lakota food, like the timsala, which is a prairie turnip that's still harvested. We harvested choke cherries. But typically on Pine Ridge, when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, we had one grocery store to service an area the size of Connecticut. And I grew up with the Commodity Food Program, which was just a U.S. government food relief program. So I grew up with a lot of government canned vegetables, which are packed in sodiums, and canned fruits, which are packed in sugars, and lots of carbs like powdered milk and government cheese and cereals. And it's a very unhealthy food base, and it really has nothing to do with us as Lakota people. And there's a lot of tribes out there, not just us, that have that same situation. When I became a chef later in life, just having the realization that I didn't know anything about my own Lakota food, but I knew I could name hundreds of European recipes off the top of my head in European languages. So it forced me to understand the history of what happened to us as indigenous peoples across North America, especially in the lower 48, and just really looking at the immense diversity that's out there and really trying to understand the value of the indigenous knowledge that's out there, the diversity of that knowledge that's out there, the relationship that we can regain and reclaim with the plant world around us. Because the Western diet's pretty much completely ignored most of what is North America when it comes to all these plants and all these flavors and all these foods, and how tribal communities have been surviving for countless generations utilizing these food systems, just knowing what to do with the world around you. So when we're talking about decolonizing food, it's really taking a step back away from those policies and practices of colonizing, of exploiting something for money, and taking a look at how can we as indigenous communities start to reclaim our identity through food, start to reclaim our health through food, and start to really understand the importance of reclaiming the knowledge of our ancestors to apply it to now, and taking steps to actually evolve ourselves into the future instead of being held down, assimilated, homogenized, whitewashed, all these things that are still happening in today's world right now.
How does decolonization work in the dining experience at Owamni?
Part of the values and just intentions that we have with the restaurant was trying to do something a little bit different. We try and prioritize purchasing from indigenous producers first locally and then nationally. And then our tier goes down to supporting local BIPOC producers and then just local producers around us. And then we buy organic at the very bottom of that whole scale. But mostly we're trying to purchase what we can from indigenous food producers and build a lot of recipes and try to make recipes and menus that really showcase a particular land space and culture. So a lot of the foods will reflect right where we are here in the Great Lakes region. You might find a dish with true wild rice, white cedar, rose hips, blueberries, walleye. All these pieces are literally something that you could just stand on the side of a lake here in Minnesota and look around and see all those pieces around you, and trying to make food really taste like that, because that's how our pantries were built pre-colonial. So it's actually wild rice season right now. I just got a call from one of my friends up north who has a big company and sells a lot of native rice up by Duluth area. And he's just out harvesting like crazy and parching the rice, and he does volumes of it. And we buy thousands of pounds of rice. We're really proud to be able to have that. And it's fun to be out there on the lakes. I don't think I'm going to make it out this season just because of my crazy travel schedule, but we're sending some people out next week and they're going up north. We try to hit all the seasons. Here in Minnesota, our season starts with maple, which is typically late March-ish, early April, somewhere in there. I feel like it's getting earlier because global warming is happening and it's coming sooner every year, little by little. But we're out there when the snow breaks and the trees start to thaw out, and that's when maple starts to run. So we collect the sap, bring that in, and cook that down into maple syrup, and then we can break that down into maple sugar by agitating. And then that just starts the whole season. And we try to be a part of all of that season because of all these things that happen with the berry seasons. And then we just passed plum season and now we're moving into wild rice season. Then it's going to be harvest season with all of the things coming out of the ground. So it's really important to stay really close to how the seasons work and when the foods are coming through, especially of your own region. We try really hard to showcase other regions. So we might have a dish that's more focused on the Southwest or a part of Mexico or way up in Alaska or the Pacific Northwest or the East Coast. We're not trying to fusionize all these different cultures everywhere. And we're not trying to cook traditional foods. I always say we're not trying to cook like it's 1491. We're trying to showcase what's possible moving forward. Like what does modern indigenous foods look like right now? And just building a new stepping stone for the next generation of people to see what's possible.
So there are over 35,000 Native Americans of different tribes living in the Twin Cities. How do they respond to the food at Owamni, which is a fine dining expression of different parts of their cultures?
Yeah, it's been a place where people come for a lot of celebrations, and we've seen a lot of different kinds of emotions coming here because it's an unusual restaurant. You don't see this kind of restaurant anywhere else. There should be Native restaurants all across the nation, and we're not quite there, not quite yet. We've gotten a lot of praise. We've gotten a lot of support, and we feel really, really good about that. And people really do have good experiences when they come here. But the restaurant, for me, it's a model of what we're trying to build because I see the restaurant as something that creates a lot of cash flow. Like restaurants don't make a lot of money, but they move a lot of money through it and push a lot of food product through it and have that purchasing power to purchase large amounts of these indigenous food products to feature them and really tell true stories through that at the same time and the job creation. So I use the restaurant as a tool to further indigenous knowledge, further indigenous food access, and showcase what's possible.
So another chef who lives here, Yia Vang, who's a Hmong American and also a James Beard Award winner. And I know that occasionally online, he'll get criticism from people in the Hmong community saying, oh, his cuisine, it's maybe too expensive, or it's catering towards white people and the European mainstream, or even in the worst cases I've seen where they say, well, that's not Hmong food. Have you ever had that kind of experience with what you're doing, which is very sophisticated?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of opinions out there. Social media can be a beast of its own sometimes. So we've definitely been targeted for this and that on some points. But really, we do have very accessible food. With the nonprofit, we've done a lot of food relief. During the pandemic and right after the George Floyd situation at the Food Lab, we were doing 10,000 meals a week and sending food to 9 out of 11 tribes, serving only healthy indigenous foods in the same vein and philosophy that we utilize by cutting out colonial ingredients and removing things that Europeans brought over here like dairy and wheat flour and cane sugar and beef and pork and chicken, and just getting healthy food out there to people to help normalize that particular situation. And we have this food truck. You can get a really low price taco for less than $15 easily. You can do the same thing at the Food Lab. There's a little lunch counter inside the market, so you can grab some nice lunch and it's not going to break the bank at all. We're working to get food to people that really need it. I'm hoping to do a lot of pantry boxes just to get food out there to people in need, along with a lot of education on what to do with these foods. Because a lot of people might not know what to do with a pound of dried corn, for example. So we want to teach people different ways that they can cook them and different recipes they can utilize that are easy to do at your own home.
What you're doing with the restaurant, as you said, you're not trying to recreate 1491. So in a way, it is very strictly traditional, but it's not authentic. And I wonder how you feel about the idea of authenticity when it comes to the food you're making.
I think we've created our own philosophy, and there's other Native restaurants out there that have created their own philosophy, and that's okay. I think it's a good time for indigenous peoples to define what their foods are right now. They don't need non-indigenous academics telling them what their ancestors ate. They could be just defining what they want to eat and how they want to move forward, and that's what we're doing. We're showcasing a path, and we created a philosophy that really works well with us. If we're going to call ourselves a decolonized restaurant and taking the steps to remove a lot of those colonial ingredients and to really have a lot of intention with every single part that we do, down to menu creation or even the wine list. We chose to have only BIPOC and indigenous wine producers to make a statement about diversity there too. And again, it's just being intentional.
I think there is an intellectual sensibility to how you present the food and certainly the way you talk about it. And you seem to have a nearly encyclopedic knowledge of indigenous ingredients and the food ways of the North American continent.
I feel like the Pine Ridge Reservation was easily 20 years behind the times just because we're so isolated. I had no idea what was going on in big cities when I was growing up as a kid because we grew up out on the plains near the Badlands. And we spent all of our time outdoors. And I was teasing my dad because he had said something about us being raised by boomers. And I was like, boomers didn't raise anybody. They just kicked us outside till dark. We had an immense amount of freedom. We were extremely feral and we were just wild, but we were also very curious about the world around us. We spent all of our time outdoors. And we spent our summers up in the Black Hills because my grandparents had a cabin that we would go to. And it was like a true cabin, not when people say cabin like in the Catskills and it's like an 8-story mansion by the lake. And we literally had a log cabin with an outhouse with no electricity, no running water. We'd spend weeks out there during the summer and just running around the Black Hills. For me, I didn't grow up around much indigenous foods because it just wasn't available to us. Reservation systems are still basically segregated communities when it comes down to it. And we were growing up with the commodity food program, surviving off a lot of government foods. My grandparents did raise some cattle, so we did have access to fresh beef, which wasn't always typical for other families in the community there too. I started hunting at a very young age. I think I got my first shotgun when I was 7 years old or something. I was pretty little, but we had a lot of birds around us, a lot of pheasants, a lot of grouse and things like that. That's just the way life was there. And then my mom moved us off the reservation right before I started high school. And I pretty much immediately started working in restaurants by the time I was 13 and just worked restaurants all through high school and then college. And then as I was starting college, I worked for the U.S. Forest Service in the Northern Black Hills. I was a field surveyor. That job made me learn all the plants and the names of all the trees in the Northern Black Hills and how to identify them, how to age them. And that's what I did every day. And that skill came in really handy much later in life when I kind of had the epiphany of doing what I do today.
Did you ever have any formal education in ethnobotany or indigenous foodways? Did you study it in college?
Nope, not at all. I had that little bit of education working for the U.S. Forest Service. So when I had the epiphany of doing this work, I was living in Mexico. I moved from Mexico to Montana, and I was living in this community called Red Lodge, which is in the southern part of Montana, just north of Yellowstone. And I was working on a ranch, and I just wanted to take something where I could spend a lot of time outdoors, but still be around a kitchen. So I started relearning some of the plants that I knew when I was a little bit younger and reconnecting and talking with elders. I was reading a lot of books on ethnobotany. And I was searching for the knowledge for indigenous foods. I would just start playing with the food, physically harvesting the food, identifying it, bringing it into the kitchen, and then seeing what I can do with it. It was a long journey, and I talked to a lot of elders in my community too, especially people in my family. They also went through assimilations. They went through boarding schools. They had a lot of our Lakota education systems completely removed by that point. They didn't grow up with Lakota as a first language like my grandparents and their parents did. What really helped the most was when I started actually doing this work and started being able to travel to different communities to put on some dinners. I started seeing the diversity that's out there across North America and experiencing firsthand and listening to some of these stories firsthand from some elders in different regions, whether it's Pacific Northwest or the Southwest or wherever I might have ended up, but listening to all these pieces and seeing this deep connection with these plants and these foods around us and seeing that commonality even way down in Mexico when I was living there with the indigenous communities there. And I started just piecing together a guide of how to understand and decipher indigenous foods no matter where we happen to be. And today, like our main focus is North America, but we also see this as a global issue because there's indigenous peoples across the globe that went through a very similar history of colonialism no matter where you are. Because I was just in Hawaii, I was just in Australia, and very similar stories. And the same thing in India, in Africa, in South America, in Central America, Middle East. There's indigenous communities across the globe that still contain a lot of knowledge, but we need to start stewarding those knowledge bases and protecting them moving forward.
Were you already thinking about these issues when you went down to Mexico?
So when I moved to Mexico, I was working a job where I was working for this large national fitness corporation that's based here in Minnesota. And I was overseeing 4 different restaurants across the city itself too, and being pulled in a billion directions, not getting paid that much really, and just being overworked, living in this corporate lifestyle that I wasn't used to at all. So all these factors led to a little bit of a burnout. And I just moved down to Mexico, and I ended up on the west coast of Mexico in the state of Nayarit, about an hour-ish north of Puerto Vallarta, and just read a lot. I was trying to figure out what to do next. I wasn't sure how long I was going to stay in Mexico, but I think that first time I ended up staying down there about 4 months. and just living in this little tiny beach town. It was beautiful. And the indigenous people that were there were the Huichol, and they were always selling cool stuff down by the beach. They had all this amazing beadwork, and I started researching them because I saw a lot of commonalities with their art, with their mythology, with their religion of what I grew up with. It was very colorful. There's a lot of animals. There's a lot of plants and things that are taken very sacred. Very similar to what I grew up with Lakota values on Pine Ridge. And the more I started researching, the more commonalities I saw. And then I just had this flash. I just had this idea that I'd been studying all these foods for so long, and I'd been in the culinary world. I'd been a chef. I'd gotten good reviews in papers, and I had a decent career, I had a decent background, and I could probably get a job most places if I tried. But I realized that I didn't know anything about my own heritage. I could think of hundreds of European recipes in European languages, and I knew very little Lakota recipes at all. And I saw exactly what I needed to do. I just saw a path lay out in front of me. I'd always been on that path a little bit anyways, growing up on the reservation, learning a few things from my grandparents and from my parents, and having that job of learning the plants when I was right out of high school and into college days, and just being very curious and having known how to teach myself and self-educate myself and what to look for. I knew that plants were going to be the key. I knew that I could reconnect with my ancestry primarily with plants first, because I knew that my ancestors had a vast knowledge of the world around them, which largely was the plant life. I feel like the animals are the easy part. Anybody could break down game meat. You could be resourceful. You can use nose to tail on pretty much any animal if you want to. But plants were a whole different kind of situation because there's so many out there, and it's not a part of our education system. We just don't learn about plants. So I started really looking deeper into that connection and trying to find that relationship with plants. And that's what set me on a path of moving from Mexico to Montana to be able to be outdoors more. And the place where I lived in Red Lodge was right next to the Beartooth Mountains. And then you had the grass plains right there. So you get a little bit of two ecosystems. And I just wanted to start to learn from a culinary perspective how to identify, how to reconnect with these plants, and how to think about how my ancestors would have been utilizing these plants and how they would have been processing and preserving, and what kind of pantry items were they making out of these things. I also had tons of other questions. Where did we get salts, and what kind of fats did we use? How did we get energy, and what were our nutritional needs? How are they being met? I had a lot of questions from a culinary perspective, but it all came down to that moment just sitting on the beach in Mexico contemplating the Huichol.
So I read recently that the 2020 census found that only, I believe, 13% of Native Americans live on a reservation, which means that most Native Americans are not. And I think about your childhood on Pine Ridge in a predominantly Native American environment. And then when you were a teenager, you moved to Spearfish, South Dakota with your mother, which was, if I understand it correctly, mostly white. I'd be curious what that was like. And I also am curious how much that contrast, going from the mostly Native American environment to the mostly white environment, how much that translates to what you're doing here today. Because I imagine it was a difficult transition.
It was a difficult transition. You know, I had a really thick res accent back then as a kid, just because I had spent my whole life on the reservation. And I just saw a lot of open racism down there, which I didn't experience before. I remember in the gas station, there was pamphlets for the KKK. And my mom, I saw a lot of racism directed directly at her growing up as a young child too. And a lot of difficulties that she faced and myself and my sister faced as we grew up in that environment. So for me, that's definitely a part of it. I remember when my mom first moved to Spearfish because she went back to school. So she went to Black Hills State University. And I was old enough where she would get a babysitter. She didn't have enough money to pay for both my sister and I. So we would go to the library. We just didn't have buildings like that. So I would just be spending all of my time hanging out with my mom while she was studying and just wandering around the library, knowing how to use the Dewey Decimal System, which is a lost art nowadays. But like just getting piles of books of whatever topic I felt like researching and just sitting in corners and absorbing whatever I felt like absorbing. To me, that connection to education was something that was really special that I still really look kindly back onwards of having that moment in my life where I got to have that opportunity to really see the abundance of knowledge that one little building held.
That's a great story. But I'm also curious, do you feel like, in a way, that Owamni is a bit of a poke in the chest to that difficulty you experienced in Spearfish, that open racism that you saw? You're beyond that now. You're bigger than that with this restaurant. And it's not just that it's a successful restaurant. It's a successful restaurant built on your identity as a Native American.
Yeah, and it's not just me because I don't take this as an egotistic situation. It's a part of my life, yes, but I just see the insanity of making a restaurant like Owamni and having it be so unique. Why don't we have Native American restaurants in every single city and every single region? It's because of the intense racist American history that we went through. So it is standing up, it is utilizing this platform to make a strong statement. I think it's really important that we can't ignore what happened to indigenous peoples in America.
So I want to ask you about the name the Sioux Chef. And first, I'm curious how you came up with that name, but I'm also curious if you ever thought about it in the context of how stereotypes work for Native Americans. Did you ever have a concern about that by using the name the Sioux Chef?
I just started using the Sioux Chef, and it was just a play on words. When I was trying to think of a restaurant name here in Minnesota, I was looking for a name that might have crossed over between Dakota and Anishinaabe to be more inclusive of both of those cultures, because I knew that the word Sioux was made up anyways. It's a shortened version of a longer word that's not a Sioux, and it's part Algonquin and part French. So it's like two languages coming together trying to describe a third party that they don't know anything about. And there's a couple of different meanings of what that word means, but they don't really know either. So one meaning is little vipers, which they would say like maybe we were jumping out of the grass and biting people. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Or the more plausible ones meant people who spoke a different language. I don't call myself Sioux particularly. I did grow up on the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe on Pine Ridge, and that word was flown around a lot. But we would say we're Lakota. And if we knew we were Lakota, we could say we're Oglala on top of that, right? Because it means specific things. But it made sense because I thought it was a funny play on words because the Sioux Chef. It's just like you live in a kitchen. I grew up in the kitchen, and the Sioux Chef is the second in command. And it was easy to understand what this meant. If you look at the logo, it's got to have something to do with native, and it has the word chef in it, so it must have something to do with food. But it just seemed like the right choice at the right time. I founded my business, The Sioux Chef, in 2014. I put out the first Sioux Chef Indigenous Kitchen Cookbook in 2017 and won a James Beard Award. And I started working on the nonprofit, which is NATIVS, North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, where Indigenous Food Lab happens.
I'm curious how you feel about the idea of embracing Owamni as a political restaurant and a political venture as a restaurant.
Yeah, I think that I do have this responsibility to really utilize this voice correctly because I could just focus on myself. I could sell out. I could just make this a brand and pop a bunch of Sioux Chef restaurants all over the place. There is a path for that. There could be a Sioux Chef TV show, Sioux Chef books, Sioux Chef shirts, but that's not what the purpose is. This should have already been done. We should have Native American restaurants all over the place. It shouldn't be so unusual to find a Native American restaurant on Native land. We should be really focused on the regional foods of North America, and we can't erase the indigenous storyline behind all of that, even if it's something shameful for the United States government to talk about. We should be a part of it. It should be embraced no matter what. So it's really important to talk about these hardships that we went through and still go through as indigenous peoples, to talk about assimilation, to talk about genocide, to talk about all these things that are true parts of American history. There's a lot of pieces that are still inhibiting us as indigenous peoples to be indigenous in today's world. So just making a statement of showcasing a restaurant, pushing back against European contributions to the foods themselves and really focusing on what's possible moving forward is a statement in its own. And it's almost more powerful what's not on the menu as to what is on the menu, really, when it comes down to it. And it is mission-based. The restaurant is the proof of concept that this can be done, that we can have a Native American restaurant in today's world with a lot of intention, with a lot of visibility, and we can do it well. We can pull it off, and we can be popular even within non-Indigenous communities.
Tell me more about these restaurants. Are they going to be at Owamni's level of fine dining precision? What sorts of restaurants are they going to be?
So let me talk through the vision of the nonprofit a little bit. NATIVS is a nonprofit organization, the 501c3. And Indigenous Food Lab is the public entity that we've created, and it's the model that we're creating. So at the Indigenous Food Lab, in the market, you're going to find a lot of dried retail products. We also have some frozen game meats like elk and venison and rabbit and duck that people can purchase that can be hard to find sometimes. We're making a lot of fun products. We process a lot of corn, nixtamalize a lot of corn, which is the process of turning corn into hominy, pasoli, nixtamal, whatever you want to call it, depending on which part of the continent you're from. But we turn that nixtamal into masa, which we make the tortillas. So if you had the tacos at the restaurant, then that's all coming from the food lab. And we're using Native American heirloom corns. So we're getting corns from different nations. We have some corn coming from the Ute Mountain tribe in Colorado, and we have some corn coming from the Pima tribe in Arizona, and we have Potawatomi corn, and we have some 3 affiliated corn from North Dakota from the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara groups, and we have some corns here from Dakota and Anishinaabe. And so we're just creating a space to process all this amazing stuff. And we make bean flours, and we're using a bunch of native beans, and of course processing a lot of wild rice, making wild rice flours or puffing rice. You just pop it, like dry toast it, and it just puffs up into almost like a Rice Krispie. We're making a lot of teas at Owamni. If you look at the tea list, like everything is indigenous plants from here, especially from around Lake Superior, like cedar and sumac and wild rice and Labrador and hyssop and mints and all these things that you could just find walking around the forest around the lake up there. We're having a lot of fun with just a lot of these products. And we have a small garden space here in South Minneapolis that's owned by the Indian Health Board. And we raise this garden that's called Mishkiki Gitagan, and it just means medicine garden in the Anishinaabe language. And it's a place where we're growing hundreds of plants there, and we're using that for seed propagation and for education. And we're able to bring some of those into the restaurant sometimes, into the food lab. And we're just creating a space to have fun, to see what's possible and see where it takes us. And one of the things we've done is also got USDA licensing to be a micro to medium-sized co-packer to help get more indigenous food products out there on the market. And we just finished a pilot project where we helped a native nonprofit locally here create an indigenous baby food. And they brought us all this heirloom squash that they grew themselves. We processed it, packed it, and we have this beautiful little product that they're able to utilize for themselves however they want to. And we want to do that with other products and help people get those steps to build up into bigger production, to see the success of these things actually happening out there. Our goal is to just be a regional center point to work directly with tribal communities and indigenous entrepreneurs around us. We want to help indigenous entrepreneurs grow their businesses, whether it's food production or catering or food trucks or restaurants or whatever it might be. And we also want to work with the tribal communities themselves and just make sure that they have some kind of indigenous food operation so their community has access to healthy indigenous foods, whether it's a small catering operation in some kind of community center or a full-scale restaurant like we have at Owamni. We just want to be a support center to help grow more of those. And we're using this place here in Minnesota as a little bit of both, because we have the food lab where we can do a lot of training and development, and we have Owamni, which could be on-the-job training right here. Then our goal is to replicate ourselves. So we're already working with groups in Montana right now to open up another food lab in Bozeman alongside MSU, where we'll have a food lab with some kind of market space. And every market space we creates a new distribution point to move more food around that region, and to have some kind of public eatery, which could be a full-scale restaurant just like Owamni. And my goal is to put those restaurants into high tourism areas, because typically those touristy areas are devoid of any kind of culture, but there's a lot of cash flow there. And we want to put a restaurant where we can create a lot of jobs, we can move a lot of food product through, and we could create some place that really is accessible to people to learn about true culture and really understand the foods and the tribes around that area. So behind Bozeman, we've got Anchorage, Alaska, Rapid City, South Dakota, Oahu on Hawaii, and we're going to continue to expand outwards and grow. Eventually, we can cross colonial borders. We can be in Canada. We can be in Mexico. Eventually, we can be all over the place. It can be in South America. It can be in Australia. It can be in Africa. It can be in India, wherever it might land. We're just trying to build something that will outlive my lifetime and set up a structure and a foundation for future generations to steward indigenous knowledge, to steward indigenous food knowledge, and particularly food systems, and help to grow a demand and understanding and a need for indigenous foods, especially amongst indigenous communities, and to get tribes to break free from having to be reliant on government foods, because the last thing we need are senators and politicians deciding the fate of our food and education, especially for people of color. And we should really be taking that power back and giving people the tools to be able to do that.
When you talk about creating food sovereignty, creating healthier food for Native Americans, cutting off the dependence on the government and maybe giant food corporations, it's something that's obviously a laudable goal, but it's not that easy to do in a modern setting, and not just because of the government and because of racism, but because of marketing. If you grow up in the United States today, whether it's on the farthest, most rural reservation or in the biggest city, the food that you're going to have access to is going to be maybe pizza or Doritos or hamburgers or whatever you may have. And that food is there because of marketing, but it's also because people like it, right? Mm-hmm. So if you are bringing out this food that's very healthy and very new to people and it's traditional, how do you get a Native American kid to want to eat that food rather than like Domino's.
Yeah, and I think that we have to start them young. We're working with the school system on Pine Ridge Reservation called Red Cloud School, and we're helping them to develop healthy food recipes for their school system. And I went in there last year just to check out and realized that most of their kitchen equipment was from the 70s, like it's basically as old as me, and nothing had really been revamped. So they didn't even have the tools they needed to even do healthy indigenous foods. So we partnered with them to start to buy some kitchen equipment so they can actually start to do some of that stuff. Then we're going to start training them and developing some recipes, putting those recipes into the language. We've seen that we have had impact on tribal communities where we come in, and this has been kind of new to have like this healthy indigenous food in the style that we do, right? But people feel good about it. They're proud that it's got their name, that they have a cultural relevance to it, that it means something deeper than just grabbing a Hot Pocket out of a gas station or something like that. And people can feel the difference. If you eat a big meal at Owamni, you don't feel bloated. You don't feel like your stomach hates you because you just had like a 6,000 calorie hamburger or something like that. You just feel good and clean. And that's how we should be eating. We don't have to use the term healthy. We're just making it indigenous, and we're finding that people are really connecting to that particular piece. Our food is gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, soy-free, pork-free. It's like all these fad diets try to get to, but we just happen to be the indigenous diet of North America. And we're hoping that some of the tribal communities could really take a hold of a lot of their own food laws to make sure that they are putting a lot of attention of bringing these foods in, getting these kids early on to be very proud of these culturally relevant foods so that they have access to them and not to have it be an oddity or just at ceremony sometimes. And have fun with it, to be creative with it, to evolve it into the future, to make really fun, interesting foods with it on scales. We could have high-end restaurants to the food truck out front. So there's a whole bunch of things that we can do to get people to be very proud. And, we chose early on not to do fry bread, for example, with the food that we did. And it was a tough decision because it's something that I grew up with.
Let's describe fry bread. Now, I'm a New Yorker. I know what fry bread is. I've never had it.
Okay.
It sounds to me sort of like a zeppoli without powdered sugar.
Fried bread is literally just what it sounds like. So it's a flat piece of dough, and depending on where you're from, there's different styles and different traditions around how it's made. But it's something that became a staple in a lot of tribal communities. And if you go to any powwow around the United States, you're going to find fry bread vendors selling fried bread, Indian tacos, Navajo tacos. But this particular recipe, if you look at the history of it, comes from the government. It comes from military forces. After indigenous peoples are being rounded up and forced marched into areas and given subsidies and given commodities like bags of flour, bags of salt, bags of sugar, vats of lard. It was an old military thing to make a very simple unleavened dough and to just throw it in some fat and fry it up because it tastes good and it's quick and easy and you don't need much. You just need water and flour. It could be as simple as that. But it becomes something that became really ingrained because it becomes an oppression food. So a lot of communities had to survive off it. And a lot of families are very proud of fry bread in their family history. A lot of people are very proud about their grandmother's fry bread recipe. But we chose not to go with it because it really doesn't have much to do with us as indigenous peoples. It's a product of colonialism. And we could do so much better because it doesn't showcase the diversity that we have. Because that one piece of food shouldn't identify every indigenous community across North America.
So one of the things you've talked about a fair amount is taking pride in indigenous foods. And obviously that's important. If you're going to change the perceptions of Native American foods within Native American communities, you have to take pride in it. But I also think there's a point that's connected to it. Pride is public and nostalgia is private. So how do you create Native American foods that people can feel nostalgic about in a personal way?
It's going to take some time. All this work is for the future. Like we're building this, but we're doing a reintroduction and we're hoping within the next 5 years, we're going to start to see more and more native food operations out there, especially in tribal communities. I'm really excited because I see a very clear picture of how understanding indigenous foods not only helps indigenous communities reclaim a lot of health and culture and solidify that moving forward, but also gives a lot of non-indigenous communities a different perspective to look at of how we can be closer to the earth, of how we can have a relationship with the plants around us, of why we should have environmental protections, why we're going to have to pivot and be smarter humans in general, because we are going through climate crisis. We're going through water crisis in many areas. That's only going to get worse. And we're not smart yet. We're still allowing giant companies like Nestle to soak up billions of gallons of water for pennies, for nothing, for fractions of pennies, just for the purpose of making a bunch of plastic bottles all over the place and depleting our water source that we really need to be protecting and stewarding a lot more carefully. I make fun of Palm Springs all the time because Palm Springs has 120 golf courses in the middle of the desert. So when you fly over Palm Springs, it's bright green, and it should not look like that. But if we have the ability to do that, we should be putting food everywhere. So instead of making golfers happy, we should be feeding people and planting food everywhere we can and making that a priority. I was just with Jose Andres in DC like a month ago, and we were just walking down the street and talking about all this work. And it's crazy, but he has so much influence. Like countries are talking to him. He's like, I don't know why countries are talking to me. I'm a nonprofit. They should be fixing these things, not relying on me to do this work. They have the money, they have the power, but he's got that power. He's moving forward with a lot of intention, and I really respect that because he's feeding people and when people really need it the most. And he's got a plan, he's got a vision, and it's working, but he's got more work than he's probably able to do because people want him to fix the world, and that's not his role particularly. He just wants to help. And that's all I want to do. I just want to help. I just really want to see this happen because it's not about me. If I have to build this persona up for good, I'll do it that way. But I prefer to just get this work done and to create a huge group of highly skilled people to do this and take over this work eventually and to take it further than I can.
Chef Sherman, this was an education. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Switchyard. I'm your host, Ted Genoways. If you liked this episode and you want to support our podcast, please share it with your friends, post about it on social media, and leave a rating and review. Switchyard is a production of the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa. Thanks to our partners at FERN, the Food and Environment Reporting Network, for their support of this episode and Switchyard Magazine's special food issue. You can order a copy of the issue on our website at switchyardmag.com. We made this episode with executive producer Marianne Andre and Charles Lipper and Cassie Lee at Volubility Podcasting. Thanks as always to TU President Brad Carson.
REAPSO is a production of the Food and Environment Reporting Network. Our executive producers are Theodore Ross, Tom Laskaway, and Brent Cunningham. Our sound engineer is Lauren Newson. I'm your host, Teresa Katsourelis. To learn more about our one-of-a-kind collaboration with Switchyard, you can check out our website, www.thefern.org, or our partner's website at www.switchyardmag.com. For more independent nonprofit reporting at the intersection of food and the environment, check us out at www.thefern.org.